Well, good afternoon. I'm Martha Minow, and it is this is the time of day at the end of a week when everyone goes to sleep, but not with this panel. I'm not going to introduce them because you have wonderful biographies in your program. I am going to say there's an interesting piece a week ago in the Wall Street Journal by Bill Galston, who I think adds something to the conversation we've already started by emphasizing that there's a difference between policy disagreements and then challenges to the structures of democracy, and that keeping that straight has been hard for people. And another point that he makes is that there's no inconsistency between liberal democracy and national sovereignty. That's a challenge I'd like to put to this panel, whether nationalism is inconsistent with liberalism, or another way to put it is populism claimed nationalism in a way that makes it unavailable for others. But that's just my little nudge as we start. And we didn't even talk about order. So, Steve, will you go first?
Well, yes, I guess I will. So thank you very much. Thanks for pulling this together. Thanks to our moderator, and thank you, Jerry, for bringing us together for this topic at this time. I thought I was last minute when I sent my paper, Jerry, to you at 1:30 a.m. on on Thursday morning. But the thrust of the analysis in the paper was basically to tell a story about how the baseline of U.S. human rights policy has never really been that high, so that when one looks at the Trump administration, although the rhetoric has been at times jarring, the sort of departure from the baseline is perhaps not as significant as one might expect. And part of the reason for that is because of the lack of truly ideological leadership within the Trump administration. And then about 3 hours later, John Bolton became the national security advisor, and the whole paper became absolutely stale. Nevertheless, I am going to work through that analysis now, and we'll see where we come out. So just for purposes of trying to create a relatively circumscribed frame around the topic, I thought the way I would approach this was to think about how the current populist cast of American politics affects the way in which the U.S. government approaches human rights policy. And of course, one could play with those definitions in any number of ways, but from my perspective, it seemed like the right way to define populist cast was to talk about an inclination to support policies that have a specifically American majoritarian preference embedded in them, as opposed to preferences that are defined by perceived global elites. And by human rights policy, I really mean the U.S. government's approach to either assuming, or actually both assuming and implementing its own human rights obligations, as well as the extent to which it's willing to use leverage or trade off other interests in pursuing human rights goals in other countries. And obviously, the objective here is to set up a conversation about what human rights policy looks like under an administration that has an avowedly America first, chauvinistic approach to foreign policy. So let's talk about the baseline a little bit, because you can't really have a conversation about what's changed unless you look at where things have been. And here I will, put forward that I'm obviously affected by my own experience. I served in the Obama administration for 5 years in the Human Rights Directorate at the National Security Council, and had a role in sort of shaping and implementing human rights policy. So I tend to look at things through that lens. People who viewed U.S. human rights policy through other lenses probably would have a somewhat different take. But in any event, I do come to this from the perspective of thinking that the baseline is really not all that high, particularly when one looks at the piece of human rights policy that has to do with the way that the United States itself implements and assumes human rights obligations. There has always been, I would say, a pronounced, I think it's fair to say, populist, certainly an exceptionalist strain of thought in the way that the United States has approached this sphere of policy. Part of that, and I think Ruth may have alluded to this in the prior panel, has to do with the way in which the United States really defines human rights policy in the sphere of civil and political rights, and really almost wholly discounts economic, social, and cultural rights. And the other is that, yes, even though we describe those civil and political rights as universal, they are awfully close to the civil and political rights that undergird our own constitutional system. And the way that the United States has sort of approached human rights policy, I guess, as a domestic matter is basically to treat it as almost a gimme. We have our system of civil and political rights. It's coextensive for all practical purposes with the international human rights system. Therefore, yes, we comply with our international obligations in the human rights sphere by complying with our domestic obligations, and that's sort of that. As a result, offices in the government that deal with human rights law and human rights policy in the space of how the U.S. is complying with those things tend to focus mostly on the relationship of the U.S. government to foreign nationals and what the protections of human rights instruments mean with respect to them. So nationals who might be on the receiving end of a removal proceeding, for example, and what claims they might be able to lodge under the Convention Against Torture would be a good example of that. And then, of course, reporting obligations that the United States has with respect to various treaty bodies, which again tend to be an exercise, although Mike Posner, I'm looking at, knows this better than I do. I may have a different view, but it's to a great extent bringing together different components of the government, explaining to them what our international obligations are, and then asking them to report out what they're doing so that those data can be shared with treaty bodies in a language of international human rights that they'll understand. When I was working at the NSC, occasionally, probably once a year, there was a group in the civil society that would come and visit me and talk about whether or not we shouldn't be creating some sort of human rights institute within the government that would try and make the government much more mindful and intentional about the way in which it imposed an international human rights framework onto the government's activities. And for the life of me, I could just never figure out how we would actually make that happen. We had this vast governmental apparatus, a Justice Department, Homeland Security Department. They were working according to statutes, regulations, the Constitution. How would it work to put just one person who knew international human rights law in the middle of all that machinery and make them at all effective? So those conversations tended to be, I think, frustrating for everybody involved. But I did think they point up an essential truth about the system and the sort of relatively low level of the baseline. There are other sort of structural features which I talk about in my paper that are effectively serve as break walls between international law and U.S. domestic law, including a Supreme Court decision taken during the Bush administration, Medellin versus Texas, which basically says that treaties are presumptively non-self-executing unless they are expressly otherwise, which means that they don't really effectively have the force of domestic law without implementing legislation. They don't create judicially enforceable rights. And decisions of the International Court of Justice also do not migrate by operation of law into U.S. domestic law. So you would think with all of those break walls, and given that treaty bodies are, I think in most, if not all instances, advisory in terms of the pronouncements that they make, they don't create legally binding, even on the international plane, pronouncements, that there would be a level of comfort with entering into new treaty obligations, but in fact the trajectory, the trend line has been just the opposite. So if you look at the way in which the U.S. government has approached treaty ratifications, there was sort of a flurry of activity in the post-war period where the United States was very instrumental in framing some of these instruments. Those instruments were not really in any significant way taken up for Senate advice and consent and ratification. There started to be a trickle in the late 60s, a few in the 70s. The big surge came in the 80s and 90s with the core instruments, the International Convention on Civil Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture, racial discrimination, I'm forgetting one, Genocide Convention, all coming through the system in relatively short order. There were a few after that, but the era of treaty ratification feels, if not over, quite significantly stalled at this point. And there's a discussion in the paper of an experience we had in the Obama administration trying to push through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, feeling like if any treaty were ever going to be able to get through the Congress, it should be this one because it was so reiterative, frankly, of protections in U.S. law and so reflective of conventions that had been developed in U.S. law that they wouldn't require any implementing legislation to speak of. and therefore it was felt, gosh, this is so innocuous. It speaks to an issue that lots of families around the country should be able to, identify with. It should be non-threatening. But in fact, and this is sort of where the populism piece comes in, it was actually viewed as threatening, or at least portrayed as threatening, I would say, by a strain of sort of sovereigntist thinkers who regarded this as another mechanism for international global elites to be imposing their thinking, their norms, even though they were our norms, that became their norms, on the United States. And then, so you had these sort of relatively detached, abstract objections to treaty making in general that then were funneled through a very vocal and well-organized constituency of homeschoolers, in this case, who fastened on certain aspects of the treaty to make arguments that that this was going to allow treaty bodies in remote locations in Europe to be dictating the relationship between parents here in the United States and their children. So you had these incredibly tendentious but well-organized and loudly spoken arguments on one side of the debate, and then on the other side of the debate you had a group of people who were saying, well, it would be good for us to join this treaty regime, but couldn't really make a very strong case for how it was going to make the world that much better for American citizens. So the imagined highly demagogued downsides were on one side of the equation, and the relatively carefully framed upsides were on the other side of the equation, and it just was no match at all. The treaty went down, and with it, the prospects for human rights treaty ratification, I think, for frankly what would have been more ambitious treaties and other multilateral treaties, not just human rights treaties, at the same time. So that's not a very happy story, but it is, in fact, relevant to baselining. The other area of the baseline that I just want to set relates to how the United States projects, preferences for rights-respecting governance through its foreign policy, how it projects that in its engagement with other countries. And here, I think the baseline has changed over time. When I think Eleanor Roosevelt was negotiating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, her vision was that this could be the cornerstone of a more peaceful global order, that societies that respected human rights would be less brittle and less prone to the kind of mass psychosis that brought about the Second World War. And so the idea was that it would serve in a sort of slightly over-the-horizon way, an interest of the United States. That mindset sort of faded, I think, during the Cold War, when a sort of us versus them mentality became the sort of defining feature of American foreign policy, and there was a desire not to let the fact that we were dealing with some pretty abusive regimes get in the way of relationships that helped reinforce a balance of power that foreign policy leaders in the United States wanted to see vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and their bloc. And thus you had strong relationships with countries like Pinochet's Chile and South Korea and deja vu the Philippines. So that's how things sort of stood for a while, but the Vietnam War, historical tides turned a little bit during the 60s and the 70s, and finally you got Jimmy Carter coming in and declaring that human rights was going to be a major objective of U.S. policy, and that sort of framed, although things ebbed and flowed for subsequent decades, but that really became a grounding principle of U.S. Foreign policy. It wasn't the exclusive objective. In many cases, it was an objective that was traded off for other objectives, but it was a major objective. There was no, at least in my experience, or there was very little push back against the idea that where the United States could influence things in a positive direction with respect to rights observance, then it should do that. Again, I don't want to make overclaim here. I think if you walked back through the last 3 administrations, you could find huge gaps and problems in the way in which the United States sought to make itself a messenger and positive agent in human rights, and some of them had to do with huge misdeeds and missteps of the government itself. So go back to the Clinton administration, wide criticism for failing to act in Rwanda and the Balkans. You look at the Bush administration and you think of detention and detainee abuse, Abu Ghraib, legal theories intended to put U.S. Officials around the world beyond the reach of law. And then the Obama administration also was criticized for expansive legal theories governing its counterterrorism operation, for the underdisclosure of civilian casualties, and for being too soft on abusive regimes from South Sudan to Myanmar. So certainly there's room for criticizing these past administrations, but in general, each one of these administrations had a human rights policy that it was out there trying to implement, and it was trying to operate within a frame of an ideal that it may not have always lived up to in its own engagements, but that it was aiming for. And I think I'm going to switch now from the baseline to the current state of U.S. foreign policy by saying I think what's most jarring about the Trump administration's foreign policy is that it's actually called into question the ideals themselves. So we have in President Trump somebody who ran as a candidate on the premise that too often U.S. foreign policy was a product of arrangements that were cooked up by Washington and foreign elites that were unfair, often in an economic sense, but not exclusively in an economic sense, to ordinary Americans. And what emerged from, I think, that sort of mindset is a foreign policy that has been driven to a great extent by economic nationalism. So that means trade protectionism and especially immigration restrictionism, by a very hyper-transactional sensibility, and by robust militarism that may not be about getting into wars, but certainly threatening them in order to achieve foreign policy objectives. What's been interesting about the sort of bulk of this president's tenure is that his foreign policy has been implemented by a bunch of people who don't really agree with him, and who have really struggled to reconcile, I think, these impulses and little clues about his thinking with a more traditional foreign policy mindset. So if one looks at the national security strategy that emerged over the winter, you can see a quite robust effort to reconcile the themes I just articulated with more conventional themes. So that is very hard to do in the area of human rights. It's probably harder than some other areas of foreign policy. And I'll just identify 3 places where I think the departure of this administration from sort of traditional norms of U.S. foreign policy making on human rights are particularly pronounced. One is in the area of human rights messaging. I know that seems corny. Messaging is cheap. That's the point. It is actually cheap, and therefore it's something the United States tends to do actually fairly effectively a lot. A word from the U.S. president can mean a huge amount. A word from the U.S. president in the right circumstances can mean the difference between lifetime incarceration and liberty for a political prisoner. It can mean the difference between a civil society organization thinking there is absolutely no hope and them thinking, gosh, we're seen and heard. There is some hope for us politically. It makes a big difference how the president talks. In this case, you have a president who doesn't really talk about that stuff very much at all, and does talk about authoritarian concepts in a sort of admiring way. Extrajudicial killing. Hey, that really works for you, Rodrigo Duterte. And ending term limits. We should give that a try, President Xi. Those kinds of things, I think, resonate in a very negative way with obviously a sort of this conventional sense of human rights advocacy. Second piece is in a transactional world, selectivity becomes a bigger issue than it ordinarily is. Under any circumstances, U.S. government human rights policy tends to be selective. We're always nicer to Saudi Arabia than we are to, for example, Uganda. I can remember going and talking to people about LGBT rights in Uganda, and they would say to us, and what conversation are you having with the Saudis about this? Tough question to answer, and a fair question to ask. But in this case, you have memos leaking from the CIA, not from the CIA, from the State Department, I should be careful about that, where you have a senior aide to the Secretary of State saying, well, gosh, we have to be nicer to our friends than we are to our enemies, otherwise, or our adversaries, otherwise we'll have fewer friends. You have Nikki Haley calling a session at the Security Council on Iran, using a much lower bar in terms of calling human rights crisis in Iran a threat to international peace and security than she's ever used for any other context in the world, and being called out on it by friends. So you see selectivity being evident in a much more pronounced and clumsy way than in the past. And the last thing I'll mention is personnel, because Mike Posner's here. It does make a difference that you can't recruit good people to come and work in an administration like this, because they're not out going and doing the shoe leather diplomacy that top human rights diplomats normally do, and that's a challenge too. There is, we can talk about it in the Q&A, there have been some saving graces in the way that the administration has organized itself, and that have kept the foreign policy, the human rights policy, from completely sinking through the floor. But since I've got the red card, I'll wait, and we can talk about it in the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much. We're so glad you're here. Wojciech, would you go next?
If you prefer, but both these presentations will be on the stage. So.
This is true, but that comparison I think would be
Sure.
good to have. So.
Of course. Thank you very much. So first of all, my very, very big thanks to the organizers, to Jerry and to his team and human rights program in this law school, and also to our chairperson, Professor Minow. It's a great honor to be here. Now, I hope at least that was heard. I could make myself heard by the room. Just in case, I thanked the organizers. Some months ago, I have sent to Jerry a very long paper asking him to perhaps circulate to those of you who might be interested in it. The paper itself is not so much about, it doesn't use human rights as a sort of general template for understanding what's going on in Poland. So my presentation here, its main part will be to provide some commentary from that point of view. But the paper may be seen as some sort of set of evidence, as documenting what has happened in Poland over the last 2 years or so. But let me precede that by at least two very important caveats. So the first caveat is about that when we talk about populism, we really need to make our analysis country-specific. I think that any successful account of populism in any given country depends on a proper combination of the general and the specific. We talk about the wave of populism, we talk about populism being emulated from one country to another, etc., as if it was some sort of single homogeneous phenomenon. Of course it's not. And each country has its own both sources, reasons, and also methods in which populism manifests itself. If I may paraphrase this too often quoted first sentence from Anna Karenina, which says that every happy family is alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own different ways. Perhaps one may say that every successful democracy is alike, but every failed or defective democracy is failed or defective in their own ways. And that certainly applies to Poland. Now, Poland, in some ways, for political scientists and political theorists, is a big puzzle. And the puzzle is that it shouldn't have happened there. There are absolutely no reason in terms of certain structural theories about where democracy usually fails as opposed to where democracy is successful, there was absolutely no reason for that to happen in Poland. There was no reason, for that matter, for that to happen to Hungary as well, but I'm talking about Poland. So if we think about some structural theories about what sort of circumstances, what patterns are good for democracy and what are bad, then we might do much worse than look at the following little summary of factors which tend to be detrimental for democracy. This is a little quote from Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way from the period when Professor Levitsky was still writing about this competitive authoritarianism. And in a nice passage, he put together, in a very synthetic way, sort of general structural prerequisites, if not prerequisites, at least factors which are sort of adversely affect democracy. So he says this: according to a substantial body of research, stable democratization is unlikely in very poor countries with weak states, dynastic monarchies with oil and Western support, and single-party regimes with strong states and high growth rates. And then he says, our own, that is Levitsky and Way, research suggests that democratization is less likely in countries with very low linkage to the West and in regimes born of violent revolutions. Now, none of these factors applies to Poland, not even oil, unfortunately. So it shouldn't have happened there. And I had a lunch last week with one of the greatest theorists and specialists in the practice of democracy, Professor Adam Przewalski, as the name suggests, from NYU University, from NYU Political Science. And he says, I have no, and sort of I started my conversation with him, why did it happen there? And he says, I have no idea. So I think that if there are some country-specific characteristics of Polish backsliding into authoritarianism or populism, it is that they are somehow underdetermined by those structural characteristics. And they show clear priority or primacy, in my view, of the agency type of characteristics. That is, of those more agentic, of the supply side rather than demand side, to use the distinction that Professor Hall used earlier. In a sense, to the activism of leadership, which provides the society with certain ideas and somehow manages in a short-term, activist way to make them salient. And my own little theory about about conditions of success of populism is that it happens when leaders successfully bundle together certain things, certain themes, which are not necessarily mutually compatible, or at least which do not necessarily connect with each other in an obvious way. But when the leadership manages to somehow bundle these themes together and convince the society that they create certain logical package, then this package may be explosive. In case of Poland, what Kaczynski managed to do is to bundle together xenophobia, fear of others, connected especially to immigration, to Islam, to refugees, to asylum seekers, again, mainly from Muslim states in the south, but also, for example, from Chechnya. Secondly, anti-elite type of rhetoric against incumbents. And thirdly, certain sense of cultural distance of an average person to modernism and postmodernism, to ideas of feminism, LGBT, green philosophy, etc. Something that also Professor Hall writes in his article. And by being able to present this package as logical, as serious, and as responding to certain anxieties and concerns in Polish society, Kaczynski managed to create this populist backsliding in a society in which, quote unquote, it shouldn't have happened in the first place. So that is the first caveat. The second caveat is about the concept of populism itself. So contrary to most people in the literature on populism these days, I do not take as my point of departure a very popular and very influential theory of Jan Werner Müller, who basically says that what is characteristic about populism is certain narrative, certain discourse of an undifferentiated noble nation or people, as opposed to some, hostile to that nation elites or groups or others. But that populists speak for an undifferentiated nation and claim that they can identify the common good of the nation, as opposed to that to a pluralistic type of entity. I do not like this theory of my friend Jan, because I believe that it hinges too much on what populists say as opposed to what populists do. And it is both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It is over-inclusive because many perfectly democratic politicians also use rhetoric that they know what the common good is, and they are not there just to represent their electorate, but they propose certain common and public good. As a matter of fact, I think it would be a very bad politician who wouldn't say that. And it is under-inclusive because many populists do not necessarily or often or routinely use that type of narrative or discourse. At least Kaczynski doesn't. So we rather need, I believe, to look at political instruments, strategies, and procedures as opposed to discourse and narrative and rhetoric. And these procedures are basically about purely and strongly majoritarian politics, uncontaminated by checks and balances, separation of powers, and constitutional constraints upon the arbitrary exercise of politics, and especially of mechanism of a leader, sort of plebiscitary type of politics, where a leader connects with the nation over the heads of various intermediary institutions which are seen as some sort of annoying burden rather than as a proper way of channeling politics. That is my understanding of populism. And note that this understanding does not necessarily in itself preempt a question asked, for example, by Cass Sunstein in the introduction to this very, very recent book, Can It Happen Here? By the way, book to which also our chairperson contributed a wonderful essay on Korematsu. So Cass Sunstein's question, does populism lead to authoritarianism? I think that we should be open to that issue. We may assume that populism in itself does not necessarily lead to authoritarianism if we adopt a relatively ecumenical notion of populism. So that, for example, movements such as Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain also are captured by the notion of populism, even there are no particularly strongly, I think, authoritarian streaks in this movement. But, and here would be the main substantive point of my presentation, which would be sort of like a comment, an oral comment to my written paper. And if we adopt that understanding of populism, which I have just suggested, this sort of political, institutional mechanisms, etc., what type of negative effects of so understood populism would we expect from the point of view of human rights? How would that type of populism typically affect human rights? What can we expect? And I think that we may sort of create a template in which I suggest there would be at least, not necessarily only, but probably most clearly the following 5 negative effects of populism on human rights. First, on the rights to vote and electoral law. Clearly populists, successful populists, that is, elected populists, elected through democratic elections, would like to change the electoral law in the direction of greater majoritarianism, to somehow strengthen their position compared to the rivals, to political competitors. So we would see some ways of manipulation in the electoral law, therefore rights to vote. Secondly, those political rights which are directly related to political competition, especially in the context of electoral campaign. Freedom of speech, especially freedom of political party, right to assembly and right to association, especially political parties. Thirdly, of course, minority rights, because here would be the, if you like, ideological anti-minority bias of populism would necessarily make populists hostile to strong minority rights, and especially rights of the most vulnerable minorities, that is non-citizen migrants, or prospective migrants. Fourthly, we may expect populists to be, for obvious reasons, hostile to accepting jurisdiction of international human rights instruments in Europe, especially of the European Court of Human Rights, somehow to distance themselves from the ECHR, something which Jeremy Waldron in his paper presents insofar as populist rhetoric in the UK concerning prisoners' rights in the ECHR case law is reflected. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we can expect populists in power to have a very cavalier or negative attitude to various institutional checks and balances which restrain majoritarian politics, and especially to courts. Constitutional courts in particular, but courts in general. Also to ombudsman office, to Okay, so now, if I had more time, which I do not have, I would use this template and sort of study the ways in which these things happened in Poland. And it's a mixed bag. So far, it's a mixed bag. In some of these items, we can tick off and say, well, they have only restricted these rights to a very little degree. Like political rights, okay, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, there have been some very bad laws about it, but they are mainly at the margins. They do not fundamentally breach the fundamental principles of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. Electoral law, we don't yet know because there was no election. They have already created mechanisms to control the electoral process by bodies, by institutions which are subjected to the executive rather than judges as before, but whether they will use it to rig elections, we don't know. The most fundamental damage that they, meaning the regime, populist regime in Poland has done is to institutional checks and balances, that is basically dismantling Constitutional Court, Supreme Court, National Council of Judiciary, and through it, the regular courts. And when I use the word dismantling, I actually am not very precise, because what they have done is not so much dismantle, but sort of to hollow out these institutions. They maintain the facade of the institutions, but these institutions are not so much disabled. Whereas they are used for the purposes opposite to what was their original raison d'etre. So if the original raison d'etre of the Constitutional Tribunal was to have, you know, in accordance with Tom Ginsburg's theory of insurance policy, you know, that this is the insurance for the opposition against the current majority, what Constitutional Tribunal in Poland now does is basically to be an instrument of the government and of the majority in its fight against the opposition. But because these changes are incremental, because they maintain the facade of the institution, and because they are, each of them taken separately, they may be seen to be relatively insignificant, while their invidious effect is only reflected in their mutual sort of systemic and comprehensive character. This is very often not visible to the outsiders. And the final point, which I want to say, is that the situation is extremely, extremely dynamic, and it changes, even not from year to year, but from month to month or from week to week. And so probably if I were to present this template of violation of rights in Poland, I would give a totally different presentation in a few months' time, which reminds me of a joke. So if I may finish with a joke, because it's already an afternoon, and it was so gloomy that we need to have a little bit of fun. So there is this joke. There is an ambulance in the middle of the night in Warsaw, and in the ambulance there is a patient who is in a coma. And suddenly he wakes up and he sees he's surrounded by those very powerful male nurses. And he asks them, "Where are you taking me?" And they say, "Well, we'll take you to the funeral home." And but he says, "Wait a minute, I'm not dead yet." But we haven't arrived yet. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
That was supposed to lift the mood?
Sorry. Exactly. That was the cheerful point. Ruth, on her way leaving the last panel, said, "This is not the most cheerful conference I've ever attended." But thank you for that framework. And actually, I think it's very helpful to have the Poland example as we return to the United States. Thank you, Doug.
So as I read the papers, I did feel, does it work?
Maybe closer.
Really? So as I read the papers, I also found myself getting not only depressed, but also began to feel a sense of a need to push back on the definition of populism. And in part it's because I teach a class now at the Kennedy School that's called Nonviolent Resistance to the New Authoritarians. We have teams working on places like Poland and the Philippines and so forth to think, what do we do under these circumstances? And in the process, we're studying nonviolent movements that have been successful over the years to try and understand the principles of action. And as I was reading many of the documents, I started saying, well, wait a minute. This might describe the way Otpor was viewed in its successful campaign against Milosevic. And did this apply to the Yellow Ribbon campaign in the Philippines? Because they also talked about the corrupt elite and so forth. And so I began to get more and more uncomfortable with this, and in the end threw up my hands and titled my talk, "In Defense of Populism." So a little contrarian. But it's important, both for my own biography, but also, I think, the history in the United States and the particular structure, I'll argue, of the United States system that requires populism in order to move things forward. So Richard Haass has called President Trump the world's most prominent populist. But for years, I've been reading in the Boston Globe and elsewhere describing Elizabeth Warren as a populist. And it's never made sense to me, and it becomes increasingly nonsensical to apply this term to such different people with such different attitudes about institutions and outcomes. So this is a very old concern. Demagogues who would stir up the mobs. This is a debate that goes back to Plato and Socrates and the trial against him for quote unquote free speech. And had Socrates been levied a fine versus the death penalty, the last 2,500 years of debate might sound very different than they did. But that he chose martyrdom has made Socrates the poster child of free speech rights over the mob. And that's largely overshadowed the fact that he was an authoritarian in today's turn, an anti-democrat whose teachings encouraged two violent, bloody coups, the kinds of things that we would do human rights reports about now. And that also overshadows that for its time, Athens had an extremely robust rule of law set of procedures that gave him a lot of protection that one wouldn't have seen elsewhere. But I think it's important that all those Greek-speaking British and American elites who grew up on Plato imbibed this sense of concern about mob rule. They were Platonists. They were Socratic principles. And therefore, they designed a system that was designed to prevent tyranny, not only of the king, but tyranny of the people. And as we all know here, we designed very anti-democratic elements in the American system. Those include, of course, the Senate, which would give equal weight to the 500,000 people of Wyoming to the 39 million people in California. It protected minorities. In other words, unpopulated states versus populated states. It protected the minority class of the South that depended on slavery. So this is the construction, in part, of an undemocratic system. But more than that, the fear of power dispersed power not only between the states and the federal, but the county, the city, the township, and then further disperses it between the judicial, the legislative, the executive. All of this is a design that makes actually getting anything done extremely difficult. It is status quo oriented. And in a status quo oriented system, the powerful, wealthy, and the powerful politically, and the powerful socially have the advantage. And they'll always have the advantage, and they have throughout American history. So an example, of course, of the difficulty is what Stephen referred to, is something we all care about, is international human rights treaties. It's embarrassing to be an American to speak to a human rights person from Britain or elsewhere who says, what's the matter with you people? Get off the dime and do these treaties. Even the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, we're now the only one, right? It's embarrassing. Except, if you were British, you just need a majority of the cabinet. The United States has the single most difficult treaty ratification system in the world, bar none. There's nothing like it in the rest of the world. It is designed to be impossible to do. And therefore, there are certain moments when something happens. And to the views of the American public, I would have to say at this point, where are treaties passed? What do treaties pass about in the present circumstance? Trade treaties. Not human rights treaties, not other friendship treaties, but treaties on trade. Treaties where that are highly concentrated in the economic benefit, and therefore have engaged the elites who would benefit from the treaties to invest in the constant politicking to make it happen, even to the extent that they create fast tracks. So the treaty obligations of the Constitution don't even apply for these treaties. And for the rest of the population, for what we are now say are the voters for Trump who are upset about globalism, treaties that create a kind of unmeasurable for them benefit. So we have a classic problem of the commons here, where especially in the development of public goods, where the benefits are for everyone, but the effort to create those benefits are often highly concentrated, that we have, through this status quo political system, a situation where it's very difficult to develop public goods that actually benefit the public at large. So even if the public prefers stricter gun control, prefers universal health care, prefers even not to have to pay a subsidy for a football stadium in the backyard, that agenda is very difficult to move forward, because it requires intent. In order to make an agenda work in the United States system, it requires long persistence which requires lots of resources, lots of time, lots of energy, in other words, lots of power to make it happen over time. And in public goods situations, that only happens when there's a strong sense of moral urgency that keeps a social movement at play through the long procedure that's necessary to make something into law. So what I'm proposing is that we think a bit more positively about the role of whatever it is we're talking about here. Populism. So, you know, some of you laugh, but you'll have your senior moments. Is that populism has been the arena where social change has been developed, social ideas have developed. The Populist Party in the United States disappeared fairly quickly by folding into the Democratic Party in the 1890s, but it was responsible for changing the Democrats from the policy of anti-Reconstruction in the South to the Liberal Party that eventually brings us Franklin Roosevelt. The Republicans and Teddy Roosevelt denounced populism, but populism created the constituency that flowed to the progressive Republicans once they became in power. So one of the advantages historically for us is that populist movements have created agendas and forced elites to consider issues that otherwise they have avoided, that they don't want to think about. But it requires the organization of people, and that means what will often look like populist rhetoric to make happen. If you follow Saul Alinsky, you can't create a social movement unless you're clear that you have an adversary. And we should certainly understand as the human rights movement that we have adversaries. Human rights movements, human rights problems are created quite often by powerful people moving a system to their own benefit, either with repression or refusing to recognize rights of economic, social, cultural rights, and so forth. So the point here is that what moves things forward is moral language. It's often emotional language. And that I believe it's very important that the human rights community not reject emotional language, but rather embrace it. Why? Because we're a movement of values. And you communicate values not through reasoned discourse, but through the language of emotion. Emotion is the language of values, and we need to learn to embrace it. So we have a problem of design. We have a tremendous need for energy to overcome that design, to make it work. And that's why I argue that populist movements have been essential for progressive change in the United States over time. Now, I respect the concerns expressed in all the papers about what I would call authoritarian populists, or even more to the point, at least from my framework, authoritarians masquerading as populists. And certainly, I would say that applies to Donald Trump. So are human rights and populists antithetical to each other? Well, no. I'm from the Midwest. The prairie populists were heroes to me as I was trying to figure out my political identity. One of my heroes was Senator Tom Harkin, back when he was Congressman Tom Harkin. Remember that Harkin and Don Fraser started the movement in Congress to build the human rights framework in Congress. It's still applicable today. Harkin is the architect of the Disabilities Act that became the basis of the convention to protect persons with disabilities. Tom Harkin, throughout his career, identified himself as a prairie populist. So people have embraced this vision of themselves and of the need to speak to the needs and values of the broader people, recognizing that they had to organize political power to overcome the difficulty of the status quo oriented government we have. What can we learn from populists in the human rights movement? Let me just summarize. First of all, we have to recognize social movements are needed to produce public goods that benefit all, and they're especially important in countries like the United States. But there's a difference between liberal and illiberal populists. And one is an ally to the global human rights movement on a moral level. One is not. We need to recognize that there are adversaries and even enemies to social progress. We need to find democratic and humane ways of fighting those. We need to engage emotions, not avoid them. Emotion, as I said, is the language of values. And we need to engage in the language of morals, of right and wrong, not just rights. Healthcare reform is a moral issue, not a technical issue, not a political issue. So moral vision and language is what is needed to keep a social movement. I just wanted to make a comment of, again, what I see to be the dichotomies of quote-unquote populism in this country. And they're typified by two movements that sound very similar. And one, of course, is the Black Lives Matter movement, and the other one is the White Lives Matter movement. People equate these, and I'm urging that we not fall into the trap of creating definitions that would cause us to equate these two movements. Because if movements were allowed to have 4 words instead of 3 words, Black Lives Matter would really be called Black Lives Matter 2, or Black Lives Matter also. Whereas the White Lives Matter would really be called White Lives Matter More. Now, one of those is a human rights movement. One of them is a human rights violator. They're both, quote unquote, populist in some definitions. We need to be able to distinguish them and vote for the ones that support our values. Thank you.
Wow, perfect. All right. So this is, of course, not a calm, unprovocative panel. This is a lively panel. I'm going to ask one question to each of you while the rest of you think of your questions and comments. And the question really tries to put together the contrast between the speed bumps of constitutional democracies that in some way each of you have described, the checks and balances, the institutions, the non-democratic features, versus the mass movements that may be manipulated by unscrupulous elites or may have some more virtuous routes. Each of you talked in one way or another about that tension between the two. Doug is celebrating the populist movements and critical of the speed bumps. Wojciech is celebrating the speed bumps in some ways, and then even in describing the hollowing out of the court, you're saying, you know, that this regime is deploying the image because they know how much it matters to people. And Steve, you in your paper, even more than what you said here, you talk a lot about the speed bumps, including the deep state, if I can use that phrase, that prevent even a new president from undoing the change from the low baseline. Aren't those speed bumps good things? Or tell me why they're not.
Okay, we'll go in. So that's very kind of you, Martha, because it gives me the opportunity to offer the last bit of my paper, which I will take to be intentional, and I appreciate it. So the last segment of the presentation was going to be to say that human rights policy has not, in fact, fallen utterly through the floor in this administration, partly because one of the saving graces of this Trump movement was that it was, or at least the Trump foreign policy is that in its initial incarnations, was largely non-ideological. It was an expression of grievance. It had a very strong transactional element. It was a pass-through for these economic nationalist sentiments that had motivated the president's base and created the circumstances for his election. But it wasn't ideological in the sort of classical sense of a neoconservative foreign policy, for example. And a lot of the thinkers who drove, foreign policy during for example, the George W. Bush administration, and created, I think, what people would regard as bad moments for U.S. human rights policy, weren't part of the mix. Obviously, that's changed right now. But you had an absence of ideology, and then you had, frankly, an administration that just didn't really know what it was doing. It wasn't really prepared to govern. It didn't expect, frankly, to have to govern, and therefore didn't really create the apparatus to govern until, it's just starting to do it right now that the president's basically putting together the cabinet that expresses who he is. And in that world, you have the bandwidth to pursue certain priorities, North Korea, immigration restrictionism, some work on trade. A lot of the stuff just hangs out on the margins and gets done by the people who've been doing it all along. And those people just keep on doing what they're doing. And as long as it doesn't create a political wrinkle or a problem for the people who are trying to focus on what they're trying to focus on, it just goes along according to plan. So I ran into a guy on K Street literally yesterday, who was a South Sudan person or a Sudan person who was so happy because he was working with a mid-level person at the NSC to design a sort of sanctions program to impose targeted sanctions on human rights abusers in South Sudan. And it was just as easy as pie. This was civil society talking to a mid-level person at the NSC, and as far as he could tell, all of his ideas were just going to go right through, and he thought, this was going to make for good policy. The problem, of course, with a system like that is you may end up with sanctions against bad people, and that may be a useful tool under certain circumstances, but largely it's often the case, or mostly the case, that if you want these tools to be effective, you actually have to have senior diplomats who are in a position to then build a policy around them and implement that policy. So that hollowing out has actually happened at the State Department to some extent, and so you're not able to marry those two together. To answer the question, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do that. To answer the question about whether it's good or bad, I think in order to have a rights-respecting democracy, you have to have counter-majoritarian institutions, and they have to be protected because the majority isn't always going to be, its impulses are not always going to be rights-respecting. So you need to have independent bodies that are capable of actually protecting those rights, and that are themselves protected from tampering. So to me, I agree actually with the challenge that Doug lays down, which is the human rights movement needs political support. It needs to be able to approve in the main to majorities so that people who are going to sustain it get elected and have the support they need to actually continue it. It can't exist without political support. But I would use the word political support rather than populism, and I think any frame in which human rights policy has a robust future is one in which there are strong counter-majoritarian institutions to carry it forward. And I would include the civil service and the foreign service in that.
So I would distinguish between populism of movements and organizations and associations and populism in power. Because there is absolutely nothing wrong for a movement having populist substance or populist messages, etc. It only means that a particular association has ambitions, extremely sort of high and expansive ambitions, to try to capture a common good of the entire society. It is doomed to failure, but no one can tell the associations not to have these sort of ambitions. But populism in power, populism which has access to actual rule, is defined, or at least I defined, by its hostility towards all these intermediary institutions, hostility to checks and balancing, and some sort of privileging of very strong majoritarian mechanisms of politics. As such, almost by definition, these types of populists who rule, whether it's Kaczynski, Erdogan, Orban, or Putin, are dangerous because they are necessarily, they sooner or later will violate human rights, such as the rights related to those checks and balances which are important for making democracy healthy also for the opposition, not only for those who have the rule.
Thank you.
I don't think that I deplore the speed bumps. What I'm just want to indicate is the speed bumps are there, and they create certain conditions, and it's because of not just the speed bumps, but other anti-democratic elements that are going to always be there. they're not going to change, that make necessary populist movements. And that rather than having the academy classify them as dangerous, I want to be more agnostic about it at a minimum, but certainly not negative. I thought I learned a lot from your piece, but I would disagree about populist movements are by their nature authoritarian once they're in power. If we go through some of what we talked about are signs of populism, such as speaking for the people. So do we begin with Richard Nixon and the silent majority? I'm speaking on behalf of the silent majority. Do we talk about packing the courts? Well, gee, does that include the refusal to vote for a justice who should have been in? Does it include, as what happened in the last few days, trying to impeach Democratic appointed members of the Supreme Court because the Republicans in the Pennsylvania Congress are upset with their ruling? We actually have, in many of the kinds of authoritarian moves, we see them very embodied in, let's face it, the Republican Party. So is the Republican Party and its procedures and gerrymandering and so forth to secure its power, are those populist moves or just authoritarian moves? Or just smart politics, which is how they would like to be characterized to us? Well, they're actually anti-majoritarian packaged as majoritarian ideas because they really have to do with securing their power. So that happens in our current situation because there are so many different levels of power here. And people can make autocratic moves where they have power on one level. And what we want is a system that levels them out across the country. And like it or not, that requires social movements. And those social movements have to adopt many of the elements of what we call populism, and always have in the country.
Okay, I think we're going to open it up, and please identify yourself, and please ask a question, and maybe start over here.
Hi, my name is Yasir Latif Hamdani. I am a lawyer from Pakistan, and I'm a human rights fellow here at the Human Rights Program at the law school. My question, essentially, and this kind of is an intersection of law and political science, and since we have discussed that, and we have discussed counter-majoritarian institutions, and given that the Supreme Court Supreme Courts everywhere, and especially right now in Pakistan as well, you have the idea of counter-majoritarian difficulty. So what we see all over the world, and with the rise of populism, is this idea that democracy ultimately will lead to some sort of tyranny of the majority. That is something that happens, in terms of one man, one vote. So I was wondering if any of you have considered the conscientialism or the consciential democracy, as it was suggested by Aaron Liphart in the 1990s, the Netherlands political scientist, conscientialism. Are you not familiar with the term? Okay.
We can let Martha answer that.
Well, it's a conception that imagines a continuing presence and political power of different groups, of multiple groups that collaborate. And it certainly has a kind of purchase in the Netherlands and in Switzerland and in other places, and then other places have failed entirely. Sri Lanka failed entirely. So I think one thing that's interesting to me about your question is populism claims to be about the people, but I don't know a populist movement that is about diversity of the people. And if you have a diverse population, what's the political structure that will respect its diversity and not let the populism that claims homogeneity wipe out the respect for the subgroups? Consociationalism is one technique. Protection of minority rights is another technique. These are all anti-democratic in some way because they require actually putting some borders around what a majority can do.
Jan Müller, who you disagree with, I disagree with too, but he says there are several kinds of populism. There's exclusive populism, which is, he says, very associated in Europe, which is we exclude minorities. And then there's inclusive populism, where we bring in minorities and others, and he associates that with the left and with Latin America. And I think we've had both of those elements in the United States. We've certainly had groups conceiving themselves as populists who were trying to develop, for example, alliances between Kansan farmers and laborers and Southern farmers and black farmers, et cetera, to try and create a broader constituency.
Usually class-based, but
Yeah,
yes.
class-based.
Yeah.
If I may just say a word, I think that this consociational democracy of Arendt Leiphart works well in countries like in the Netherlands, because on the one hand, we have clear segments of the society. At the time when Leiphart was writing about it, it was about religious groupings. But at the same time, there's a very high degree of social consensus around the sort of common good. I mean, the Netherlands, especially in 1956, it doesn't strike us as particularly divided society. When we look at consociationalism, which was applied to societies such as Lebanon or Bosnia and Herzegovina, where it was meant to bring social peace, it simply didn't work because there wasn't even a modicum of consensus which would allow it to work.
I guess the only thing I would add to this, and it may not be directly on point, but when we used to do human rights advocacy for really despised minorities in some communities. For example, I used the example of going to some of these sub-Saharan African countries and talking about LGBT rights, where you were facing populations that would be 90 or 95% in favor of criminalization of these, or death penalty in some of these cases. What the communities there that, the communities, the victim communities would, I hate to use that term, but would tell us was, please don't isolate our rights situation and talk about LGBT human rights. Let's talk about associative rights that appeal to a much broader constituency. That will allow us to develop a little bit of political momentum behind our cause. Otherwise, we become isolated, and it really doesn't help lift up our situation at all.
Right. Allies.
Great.
Yes, thank you. I had a question for
Identify
Mr.
yourself.
I'm Jimena Reyes. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Human Rights Program. And I had a question for Mr. Sadurski. In the support that the population gives to Kaczynski, how important or what role has his position towards World War II and the role of Polish in World War II? And I also had a comment, which is that an issue that we haven't mentioned yet, and I think it's a common trend to many populists today, is also the way they see and they treat women. And I think in that respect, what's happening in the last days about reproductive rights in Poland, it's quite interesting. Thank you.
Well, both points are very well taken. When it comes to relationship between the women of this government, of the peace regime, PiS is a Polish acronym for Law and Justice Party, of Kaczynski's party, to women, it is very much determined by the Polish Catholic Church's political theology, which is extremely backward even by the Vatican standards. And therefore, currently, there is an attempt of change, for example, anti-abortion law in a way which wouldn't allow even those very, very few exceptional circumstances, like the defects of the fetus, to warrant a right to abortion. So this is very well taken. Also, your reference to the Second World War is interesting. You obviously have in mind a recent, absolutely outrageous law that they passed about punishing up to 3 years for those who would attribute responsibility or co-responsibility to Polish state and Polish nation for the crimes of genocide committed by Third Reich on the occupied territory. I think I have almost literally cited it. Now, this is part of the almost totalitarian sociotechnic, because totalitarianism, my understanding, means that an authoritarian government wants not only to control behavior, but also minds of people. And here is simply an idea that the government may draw extra support. I don't think that in itself it's a very important factor, but as an additional support from certain pathology in Polish collective psyche, which means that we want to celebrate, we love to celebrate our victimhood, and also to always make sure that we are never perpetrator of anything bad, rather we are always victims of other people. And now this idea that you can punish for that by criminal law is also idiotic, because it only suggests that there is something to hide. You know, otherwise you wouldn't have to punish for these type of statements. But I think that Kaczynski, unfortunately, very skillfully exploits this pathology, this sense of victimhood and dignity, based on always being a victim, never a perpetrator in the past.
Thank you.
And that happens probably in Austria also.
Well, Poland doesn't have monopoly for that. But
Unfortunately.
because of our history, it is particularly pronounced there.
Hi, Larry Helfer from Duke Law School. I have a comment and question for Steve. So, particularly about the baseline. And I'm sympathetic to your description, but I wonder, you know, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, whether the kind of thing you described for the Disability Rights Convention, or indeed other treaty bodies, is really the opposition from homeschoolers in that case, or others who were opposed, is necessarily off point, because it seems to me that human rights advocates ought to own up to the fact that they sort of have a two-pronged strategy with respect to recommendations of treaty bodies, all the non-binding law stuff that is persuasive. On the one hand, at the time of ratification, they say, oh, no, this is all just non-binding. It's, don't worry, whatever they say, you don't have to follow it. And then the moment it's actually you're part of the treaty system, they then say, look, you really need to do something about this. It's true, it's not binding, or if they even say that, but in fact it has persuasive value, and let's try to persuade a court or, you know, a state legislature. I'm playing devil's advocate here, but at the same time, you know, the expansiveness of the norms themselves is not a fantasy. It's real, and it happens by virtue of the institutions that interpret those norms, whether courts, treaty bodies, and others. So I'm just wondering whether, if I'm going to be provocative, since the panel seems to be provocative, is to
Not
say,
me, just these guys.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, you have to join in now, yeah. Have you accurately described the baseline? Is, in fact, the baseline, is the skepticism really more well taken than the kind of conventional wisdom in the human rights community would suggest?
So I have meticulously described the baseline, although I also agree with what you're saying. So I agree that there is a degree of overreach to some, at least among some of these bodies. I think that, you do do I don't want to use, there is sort of an activist strain, in the way that courts have, interpreted their core instruments. If you're talking about the European Court of Human Rights, we'd all think of examples of that. And I think Jerry's paper talks a little bit about this. So I don't want to characterize it out of hand. But here's the thing: the issue with the treaty, with the CRPD, the sovereigntist concerns that were raised and that ultimately became the impediment, because we made two runs at it. There was the one where Bob Dole sat in the well of the Senate and people walked by him and voted no. There was another effort to try and make a push, I think it was at the end of 2014. And ultimately what collapsed the treaty were demands for reservations, understandings, and declarations that weren't particular to a human rights treaty. They were really, if I remember correctly, the kinds of demands that might have been made with respect to almost any treaty. They were or any major multilateral treaty. And they reflected, I think, just a sort of growing sense of empowerment in this sort of realm of sovereigntist legal thinkers that that they could make the price of ratification sufficiently high that no responsible executive branch lawyer would ever feel comfortable agreeing to those RUDs. And there were some very difficult conversations about this inside the executive branch where we tried to figure out whether or not we could live with them. And ultimately decided we probably could, but by the time we did, the offer had been pulled back. So if I'm remembering the circumstances correctly, most of these were not, they weren't really particular to the species of treaty. They were more sort of general. And I guess the reason that conversation fits within a conversation about populism and human rights is I think the suspicion of these treaties was really a suspicion of these treaties being a vehicle for the preferences of global elites versus what our domestic political constituencies might put on the law books themselves.
Doug.
So I want to just refer to that particular effort because, as Steve told us, the homeschool people were organized and very vocal. So over the last 20 years, there's been a major effort among disability groups, parents representing disabled children, et cetera, to do things like study parliamentary procedure so that they could not be rolled over when they went into city council efforts and so forth. There's been an attempt in the South, as well as all over the country, of disability groups to learn political skills. I remember in the anti-war movement, all of us had to learn Robert's Rules of Order so the Democrats wouldn't roll over us in the 68 precinct conversations, right? Very, very useful skills. Were they present in this event? No. So the right's very good about organizing. They have no problems with authority. Human rights community, not so much. We rely on information politics, a little bit of naming and shaming here and there. But no one was going through and said, we're 7 votes short. Here are the places. These are the places where the disability groups are best organized. They're going in there, and they're going to embarrass this senator in order to protect their interests and represent disability rights around the world, because we, as people of disability families, care about disabled around the world. There was no attempt to fight back and move from this rather passive elitist view to a citizen's view that, in fact, these are values that we care about. So it requires an organizer's point of view to make these happen, not a stand by and just try and see what happens in the halls of Congress and hope for the best. Bob Dole was great. That was a great idea. But it was still centered there when the votes are out there.
I think we have time for one more question. Right in the back, someone who hasn't spoken. Yeah. And just identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Hui-Ling Pan. I'm actually a master's student at the School of Public Health, so bringing in a different topic. In my field, we care about the effective translation of rights and entitlement on paper and in concepts into effective policies and programs, and then actually actions on the ground in terms of implementation. So I would like to hear the whole panel's thoughts on, given the current type or types of populism we have seeing on the rise today, the different nuances there are, and the drivers for it, what are the implications for public policies and programs? And then if the effects are negative or the implication is a barrier, what kind of strategies do we have to actually deal with it?
Who would like to take this?
So I'll do a very brief. I think it's a great question. I think if we're looking at the impact of populism on U.S. government human rights policy, and by that what we really mean is the ability to view at least some realm of foreign policy through the lens of trying to advance human rights in countries where they're below par. I think I'm going to go to sort of where Doug was taking us to some extent and say there needs to be a political constituency for that approach to foreign policy in order for it to have any hope, because we're going to see a diminution over the next 3 years now that I think the administration is organizing itself and will become much more programmatic about pulling back, for example, from multilateral institutions where the United States actually is able still to participate in useful sort of collective responses to human rights crises around the world. And certainly, I think our credibility as a spokesperson for human rights bilaterally will diminish as well because of the rhetorical issues that I flagged in my presentation. So we're not headed into a good space for this next several years, but that may actually create a political opportunity for trying to generate support for this set of issues as a foreign policy priority for the United States. So I think, to my mind, it may not be as particularly satisfying answer, but to my mind, we're in a not great space for a couple of years. I think it's important that the community of people who care about these issues figures out what its priorities ought to be, and then figure out a language, and it can be a partly emotional language, for communicating that to the American people and actually creating the political support so that it has some viability in the next administration.
So let me offer a slightly different take on your question. So when you ask about translating rights on paper into policies, I think it is one lesson that we can learn from pathological populism, because there may be good populism, but I'm now thinking about populism which is dangerous, is that populism doesn't consider, when it looks at rights, or it looks at the institutions, or whatever else is written, say, in the Constitution or in statutes. It pretends that there do not exist any norms behind them, that there aren't any conventions of understanding, of significance, and of interpretation, which are equally as important, and sometimes even more important, than actual words. They do violate what let me return to him again, Levitsky and Zidblat in this recent book, How Democracies Die, the principle of this mutual self-restraint. That is, that when you exercise power and have a particular basis for power, whether it's a right in a Bill of Rights or a description of competences of the institution, you do not push your competences of your authority, of your institution, whether it's president or whoever else, to the limit, because there are certain norms which provide certain raison d'etre, certain rationale for having these rights or institutions in the first place. So when I look at the worst damage that Kaczynski is doing, and his sort of group, his cohort, his acolytes, to Polish law, is not just merely that they very often obviously violate the law, they breach it. It's an easy case. What they often do is they pretend, oh, well, since the Constitution doesn't say exactly a particular thing, we can do anything. Since the Constitution doesn't say exactly who is electing judicial members of the National Council of Judiciary, anyone can do it, and therefore we will give this power to the parliament, which today means de facto to the ruling party. They pretend that there isn't any norm which suggests, well, even if a law is silent about something, in order for it to make sense, in order to serve the original purposes, we must combine the words with the norms. But they pretend, we do not have it because the law doesn't say that openly. And that is, I think, this violation of unwritten but extremely important norms of civility, I would say, is the worst damage that populism does to our understanding of law.
So from another point of view, these were good for me, thank you. At the Kennedy School, we're actually having this conversation because the whole school is based on this idea that you learn how to do policy analysis, you lay out the alternatives, it's all very logical, and good policy gets made. And suddenly we're saying, what? Does this work? And so we're in somewhat the same positions. And in fact, what is it? That's the elite point of view that people, in fact, are objecting to. This is not just a technical issue. It is an issue about being clear about what the consequences to people are about decisions, understanding the potential damage, or really articulating the advantages very, very clearly. It is seeing this as not just a technical problem, but a political issue, always. And therefore, also a moral issue. I say emotion is the language of values, but we also, as we study and we think about stuff, we come to certain views about what's the right thing to do and what's not. Those are also moral decisions that we need to be engaged in. And what's more moral than the whole human rights movement as an attempt to address the needs of people worldwide on the basis of what's right and what's wrong? So I think that our professional schools have to rethink our paradigms and include much more work on how do we think strategically, how do we move something forward, how do we really understand the politics and the impact before we roll it out to people about what ought to be done.
Well, not to sound like a panicked person, although I am, I guess I think that the normal science that we usually teach about policymaking is not what's needed right now, because we have a much bigger problem, which is that respect for knowledge, expertise, facts, institutions, democracy, those are in trouble. And at the same time, let's be clear, as Professor Hall's presentation made clear in the first panel, many of the people who are claiming to be part of the populist movements, and Doug certainly has expressed this as well, they're people who are saying, what about our rights? What about us? And so for the human rights movement in particular, this is a major crisis. And that's why I want to thank the organizers for framing this conversation and thank our panel. Thank you all.
That was fun. I really enjoyed that.